The thing about the Eternal Archive was that nobody owned it. This was not a legal statement. It was not a philosophical position. It was simply a fact that had been true for so long that the question of ownership had stopped occurring to anyone, the way the question of who owned gravity stopped occurring to people once they understood what gravity was. The Eternal Archive was the oldest structure in the known galaxy, older than any current civilization by a margin so large that the number had stopped feeling like a number and started feeling like a concept. It existed in a fixed point in deep space that no natural process should have produced and no known engineering could replicate. A structure roughly the size of a small moon, perfectly geometric, made of a material that resisted every form of analysis that any civilization had ever applied to it, and containing, as best anyone could determine, a complete record of everything that had happened in this region of space for approximately 4 million years. Nobody had ever gotten inside. Not for lack of trying. Every civilization that had achieved had eventually sent a mission. Some had sent many. The archive did not repel them, did not threaten them, did not respond to them in any way. Ships could approach, could dock against the exterior, could spend years mapping the surface and analyzing the material and attempting every known method of entry. Nothing worked. The archive simply existed, complete and silent and entirely indifferent to the efforts of the various civilizations that flew around it and pressed their instruments against its surface, and went home with data that described what the archive was made of without explaining what it was made of, which was the kind of result that drove scientists to extended periods of professional despair. There was a Galactic Council resolution, passed 200 years ago and renewed every decade since, establishing the archive as protected neutral territory. No weapons within 10,000 kilometers, no territorial claims, no mining or extraction of any kind. The resolution had passed unanimously, which was rare enough that people still mentioned it when discussing the archive, as if the unanimity itself was data about what the archive meant to the civilizations that orbited it and could not enter it. Humanity had sent 3 missions. The first had been purely observational, standard survey protocols, external analysis, the careful documentation of everything that could be documented from the outside. The report had been thorough, professional, and had concluded with the honest precision that Earth's scientific establishment prided itself on, that they had learned a great deal about what questions to ask next. The second mission had been more aggressive, experimental entry attempts using 17 different approaches developed specifically for this purpose. 16 had produced no result. The 17th had produced a result that the mission report described as anomalous and not yet fully characterized, which was scientific language for something that had happened that nobody knew what to do with yet. The third mission was Doctor. She was not what the Galactic Council expected when Earth's representative announced that humanity would be sending a specialist for a third attempt. They had expected a team, engineers, physicists, the kind of assembled expertise that major scientific undertakings required. What arrived was one woman, 53 years old, with close cropped hair and a worn leather satchel, and the particular quality of focused attention that made people feel, when she looked at them, that she was seeing something they had not noticed themselves. She had 3 doctorates. She had spent 20 years working in what Earth's scientific community called anomalous systems research, which was a field that had not existed before she created it, and which studied, specifically, the category of phenomena that resisted conventional analytical frameworks, not because the phenomena were inexplicable in principle, but because the frameworks being applied to them were built on assumptions that did not hold in those specific cases. Her central argument, developed over 2 decades and 500 pages of research that had been simultaneously celebrated and argued with across the galactic scientific community, was simple. You could not understand a system by applying frameworks developed for different systems. You had to develop frameworks from the system itself. You had to let the thing you were studying tell you how to study it, which required a quality of listening that most scientific training actively worked against. She had been studying the archive's anomalous response to humanity's second mission for 3 years before requesting authorization for a third attempt. The council representative from the head asked, at the authorization hearing, what specifically she planned to do differently from the previous 47 missions conducted by 12 different civilizations over 200 years. She had thought about it for a moment and said, "I'm going to ask it what it wants." The representative had looked at her for a long time. Then he had approved the mission. Arrived at the archive alone. Her ship was small, a research vessel designed for single-occupant extended missions, with equipment that she had herself, and that the engineers who built it had found unusual in ways they could not quite articulate, but had built anyway because the specifications were precise, and the funding was authorized. She spent the first week doing nothing that looked like science. She floated in the observation bay and looked at the archive. She ate her meals looking at it. She slept with the observation screen active, so it was the last thing she saw before sleeping, and the first thing she saw when she woke. She read everything, every mission report, every analysis, every scientific paper, every council resolution, every account from every civilization that had ever approached this thing. And she did not take notes, and she did not run simulations, and she did not attempt any form of contact or analysis. She was, as she had described it to the one colleague who had asked what she was doing in the week before departure, learning the shape of the question before trying to answer it. On day 8, she did something that appeared in her mission log as initiated passive resonance observation, and that was, in practice, something considerably simpler and considerably stranger. She talked to it, not with instruments, not with signal broadcasts or mathematical sequences or any of the formal contact protocols that previous missions had used. She sat in the observation bay and talked, conversationally, the way you talk to someone you are not sure can hear you but want to reach anyway. She talked about the archive, what she thought it was, what she thought it wanted, if wanting was a concept that applied, and she was not sure it was but was using it provisionally because language required some conceptual framework and wanting was the closest available one. She talked about what she found interesting about it and what confused her, and what she thought previous missions had misunderstood. She talked about humanity, about what humans were, and how they thought and what they found beautiful and what they found difficult, and why she personally had spent 20 years studying things that resisted understanding, which was a question she had been asked many times and had many answers to, none of which felt complete. She talked for 6 hours on day 8. On day 9, the archive opened. Not dramatically, not with light or sound or any of the cinematic signals that the word opened implied. A section of the exterior surface, 40 meters by 40 meters, perfectly square, perfectly flush with the surrounding material, simply was no longer there. Where it had been was an interior space and a passageway, and at the end of the passageway, something that instruments could not characterize, and her eyes could not fully process, and her mind kept trying to describe in terms that felt approximately correct and precisely wrong simultaneously. She went in. She was aware, as she walked down the passageway, that she should probably be more frightened than she was. She had a scientist's relationship with self-examination, and she examined herself carefully as she walked and found, with genuine curiosity, that what she felt was not courage exactly. Courage implied overcoming fear, and the fear was present but quiet, sitting in the background like whether rather than filling the foreground like a wall, but something closer to recognition. The feeling of a question she had been carrying for 20 years, finally having an address. What was in the archive at the end of the passageway was not a room exactly, and not a presence exactly, and not information exactly, though it was something of all three. It was the best she could do in language that had not been built for this. What she understood from it, not downloaded, not transmitted, not communicated in any way she could fully describe, but understood, the way you understand something you have always known once someone finally says it clearly, was this. The archive had been waiting, not for humanity specifically. It had not known about humanity 4 million years ago when it was built, but it had been built with a purpose that required a specific kind of mind, and it had been waiting for that kind of mind, and it had encountered many minds over 4 million years, and none of them had been quite right. And then humanity had arrived, and the second mission had produced the anomalous result that it spent 3 years studying, and the anomalous result was the archive noticing. Noticing that something was different about the minds in those ships. Not more intelligent, not more powerful, not more advanced in any measurable technical sense, but different in a specific way that mattered for this specific purpose. Human minds were, in the archive's assessment, and it had assessed minds for 4 million years across more civilizations than the current galaxy knew had existed, uniquely capable of holding contradiction, of maintaining two incompatible frameworks simultaneously, and working in the space between them rather than resolving the contradiction by abandoning one framework or the other. Every other mind the archive had encountered resolved contradictions. Humans lived in them. The archive had been built to transfer its contents. 4 million years of complete galactic history, preserved by something that had understood 4 million years ago that civilizations ended and knowledge was worth preserving past those endings. But the transfer required a mind that could receive it without resolving the contradictions it contained. Because 4 million years of history contained contradictions that could not be resolved, only held, and a mind that could not hold them would simplify them in the transfer, and the simplifications would be wrong in ways that mattered. It had been waiting for minds that could hold 4 million years of unresolved truth without needing it to be simpler than it was. It had been waiting for humans. Spent 41 days inside the archive. She did not experience this as 41 days exactly. Time inside the archive had a different texture that she spent several pages of her mission report attempting to describe and eventually summarized as experientially compressed in ways that did not feel like compression. When she emerged, she was unchanged in any way that her ship's medical systems could detect. She was also, in ways that would take years to fully understand, carrying something that had not existed in any human mind before. Not knowledge exactly, not memory, something closer to access. The ability to know what the archive knew in the way you know your own memories, not recalled from storage but present, available there when you reached for them. She filed her initial mission report from her ship, which took 11 hours and was the longest document she had ever produced. And then she slept for 18 hours, and then she transmitted the report to Earth and to the Galactic Council simultaneously. The Council read it over 3 days, then they requested a session. She attended the session in person. 47 representatives, the same chamber where years ago someone had finally said that they needed humans. She answered questions for 6 hours. The last question came from who had been on the council for decades and had seen things that had recalibrated her expectations of what was possible many times. "Why you?" asked. "Why did it open for you when it did not open for anyone in 47 missions over 200 years?" "Thought about it honestly. I asked what it wanted," she said, "instead of trying to get what I wanted from it." She paused. "I think it had been approached as a problem to be solved for 200 years by very good minds with very good tools trying very hard to extract something from it." She looked at. "I think it had been waiting for someone who came to listen instead." The chamber was quiet for a moment. "And what did it want?" asked. "To be understood," said, "same as everything." She said it simply without drama, as if it were obvious. Because to her, after 20 years of studying things that resisted understanding, it was.